Dr. Wallace, who's going to be with us next, our next speaker. And he's a trained psychologist in clinical treatment clinical treatment of families. Charles Wallace earned his PhD in 1990 at BYU, and during the time, Dr. Wallace published professionally, including co-authoring numerous journal articles on the incident and prevention of premarital teen pregnancy. He taught at the university level for 12 years, worked in treatment programs for youth over 20 years, 12 of them clinical director for the Anastasi Foundation, a very successful youth treatment program in Arizona. Dr. Wallace is the director of facilitation for Arbinger and the trained consulted with organizations in the United States and internationally in multiple industries, including healthcare, military, government, aerospace, retail, biotechnical service and professional groups, and telecommunications, among others.
Okay, thank you. This is an amazing group to speak to and to look into your faces and to realize the work you're engaged in. I recently had a very interesting experience. I traveled to the state of Hawaii to spend a little time learning about an organization within the military. They go to battlefields and recover the remains of soldiers who've perished. They told some pretty amazing stories about after recovering those remains, they then make effort to identify them, to have the families now know that their soldier was found, what battlefield he was in, and they locate that and identify that through DNA. In fact, one of the really remarkable ones is they had discovered one set of remains that they'd narrowed it down to about 5 possible families given the battle and what records were there. But they still couldn't quite nail it down until they found letters that one of the widows had that her husband had written her from the battlefield. Where he had licked the envelope was enough DNA existing for them to then identify the body. Pretty amazing technology, really remarkable technology. The story that they told that most struck me was recently they had a family from Utah, a very large family, come to pick up the remains of their son and grandson. And he said it was very interesting. They have a room off the laboratory where they bring the families in and then they bring the remains into the room. And they don't let the families into the lab because then you have to worry about their DNA and accounting for that. So they brought the remains in, which weren't much. The soil is so acidic in Vietnam that not much is left after all these years. It's been a while. They had a few remains. They had no dog tags, but they had also a small piece of cloth that was with him. When the family was shown the remains and how they went through the instruction, how they had positively identified him, and that they were certain about that, this family of Mormons just kind of stood there. Now, most times, it's a very emotional experience, but this family did not have that experience until he showed them the cloth. And that cloth was a part of his underwear. You remember the stories of Vietnam, what came out of there, the struggles that the soldiers had, the things they engaged in. This family's biggest worry was, did our son keep his covenants? What they showed him was his garment. Clear evidence that he was wearing it on the day he died. And then the family just began to sob to know that their son had been worthy on the battlefield. Now, we don't have the time. When I think about the problems you face, there's a gentleman who's going to speak after me, Dr. Wood, who's going to talk about how to address those things. What I'm going to say is not going to solve the problems of suicide and rape, of homicide, of the fractured families, maybe we can do something about that. My question is, what I'm going to try to talk about in our time, is there anything I could do that might help you with your family? When you come home from deployment, when you work with other soldiers who are struggling, when you face the difficulties you do you ever take that home in a way that it's hard at home? Now, I would ask the chaplains, but I suspect the answer would be more honestly given by your spouses and your children. They would notice the effect of all that you face, all that you have to work with. Sometimes that comes home, and sometimes that hurts. So I just want to talk about what we might do there, what's possible there. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to give you kind of a framework that might help you think about those kinds of experiences. I'm going to start with the problem of seeing. You know, the human eye is really interesting. Because of the way the eye is actually physically constructed, we have a blind spot. It's the place where the nerve goes into the retina. Okay? And when you look out, you know what? You can't find it. Right now, each of us has this problem. There's a place right about here in my sight that I actually cannot see. And yet when I look, it's all filled in with data, which is really interesting to me. There's actually no data there, but my brain supplies it. Well, I work with an organization, we talk about something called self-deception. And it's the sort of thing that supplies the wrong information to our experience. And I want to talk about that. I want to start with a possibility. Let me ask you, I'm going to ask some questions and sort of look for head nods and maybe a raise of hands as we go through this. The first question would be this. Have you ever had someone apologize to you and you felt like they didn't really mean it? Anybody ever have that experience? Well, that's easier. Anyone never had that experience? Yeah, no hands. How about this? Anyone ever have you were given a compliment and you actually felt the person was fishing they were after something, they were trying to get something? Anybody ever have that experience? Well, notice this. One thing to notice that's going on is those individuals had the behavior right. You recognize that was an apology. You recognize that was a compliment. But that's not all we assess, we humans. That's not all we look at or pay attention to. We actually pay attention to something deeper, okay? I remember on one occasion, my wife and I had left Costco. We were shopping. We only had 2 items. We had hurried through the store, wanted to get home. When we got back in the car, my wife, Debbie, turned to me and said, "Are you annoyed with me?" And I said, "Well, no." She says, "Well, it sure seemed like you're annoyed with me. You rushed me through the store, and I know you like Costco. I know you like to dawdle. So I'm actually thinking that you're annoyed with me." And I said, "No, you're wrong. I'm not." "Well, I think you are." Just a hint, by this point, I am annoyed. But I'm still pretending I'm not. As we're driving home, I realize she's not going to let go of this. And somebody needs to step up and solve this problem. Someone needs to be a peacemaker here. Someone needs to take initiative. So I turned to my wife and I said, "Okay, Debbie, it's clear you need someone to be wrong. I'm willing to be that person. I'm sorry I was annoyed with you. I apologize. And I commit to be better." And she said, "Like you mean that." So I had the behavior right, if you will. I apologize, except for that part where you need someone to be wrong. That's just a flat-out accusation, if you haven't figured that out. But there's something deeper than our behavior that we pay attention to all the time. That's why we don't accept just the words of apology, okay? In my organization, philosophically, that's called our way of being, okay? So what is above is what we do, what we say, what we communicate. What's deeper than that is how we see and regard people, okay? And we would suggest that there's just 2 basic ways. In one way of being, when I look at another, I see that they count like I count. They matter in the same way I matter. They're just as much a human being as I am, which means they have hopes, dreams, thoughts, feelings, experiences, relationships, successes, failures, needs and wants, etc., etc. Because I have those, that's what I know about them. So in one way of being, I see that others, well, they count like I count. They matter the way I matter. But I don't always see people that way. And in that moment, I did not see my wife that way. Instead, I felt like she mattered less. She was a problem. She was something to be solved. So sometimes I see others, they don't count the way I count. They don't matter the way I matter. A simpler way to say this is, in one way of being, when I look at another, I see a person. I'm alive to their humanity. Whatever little or a lot I know about them. The other way could be said, in this way of being, I don't see a fully human being. Instead, I see an object, a thing or an it. Okay? And in this way of being, three general ways in which I might see people as objects is I might see them as a problem. They're in my way. They're an obstacle, an obstruction. They make life hard. Anyone ever drive in here? Anyone ever see another car and driver as somebody just a problem for you? Another way is I might see people as vehicles. I might be able to get something through a relationship with them. I might be able to get them to do things for me. When I was young and had children, well, I still have them, but when they were small, I remember sitting in front of the TV watching a game one Saturday, and I didn't want to get up and move. I wanted a drink. I wanted some soda or something, but I didn't want to have to get up. But there were these little servants laying around, and I sent them to their mother to get me a drink. Well, in that moment, I wasn't worried about disturbing them. I was just worried about whether I was going to be disturbed. In that moment, they were less to me. They were less relevant. Their life didn't matter to me the way mine mattered to me. So they were vehicles, if you will, someone to be used. Anyone ever had that experience? You ever felt used? Yeah. Have you ever used another, is the deeper question. Oh, no. Not me. I'm not like you, Chris. You use your children. So let me ask you a couple of questions about this. Maybe in a third way, so obstacle, vehicle, a third way we might see someone as they just really don't matter at all. They're irrelevant. Okay? Ever felt ignored? You're trying to make a point, you're trying to say something, you're just ignored. Well, that's when someone's seeing you as irrelevant. But the more important question is, have I ever ignored others? Have I ignored their thoughts, their feelings, their struggles? Have I just ignored them? And what's that like for them? What's it like to be on the receiving end of that? As painful it is to be ignored, it's far more devastating to my soul to ignore another. That troubles me deeply. So think for a moment. Just ask yourself these questions. In which way of being do you think I'm more likely to blame someone? When I'm seeing them as a person or when I'm seeing them as an object? Okay? In which way of being do you think I'm going to feel more taken advantage of, more victimized by them? When they're a person to me or when they're an object to me? Okay? In fact, in which way of being do you think I'm going to insist, I'm more likely to insist I'm right and they're not right or they're wrong? When they're people to me or when they're objects to me? Interesting, right? Well, this simple diagram, if you think about it, is a very powerful diagram. There are all kinds of things we do, the behaviors we might exhibit, okay? That's on the surface. That's what you can take a picture of, so to speak. But what's deeper is how I'm seeing and regarding people is actually what matters most. We know that in our relationships. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We ought to learn from that. So do others. Okay? Well, with just that, I want to talk about this simple idea of trying to help things go right. And I want to start by having you think about this. Have you ever had this? You want someone to change? You ever had that idea? Anyone coming to your mind right now? Well, is that a problem to want, to wish, to hope someone would change? Is that a problem inherently? I'm hoping you're answering no. It's a very different thing to try to change someone. And quite frankly, that previous diagram, when I'm seeing people as objects, that's actually what I'm doing all the time. I'm sending a message to them about how they need to be different. Okay? Well, I want someone to change. Is that a problem? I'm going to suggest no. Okay? Now, I want to show you something here. It's a clip. Some of you may have seen this. Oh, it started.
Anyone would catch you, but you just slammed your door into my car.
Hang on, can you hear that?
You say you're sorry, lady. You don't have to take that tone. It's not like I'm hurting your resale value.
Actually, I'm going to start this again. I'm sorry. Just because I want you to think about a couple of questions as we watch this video. It's from a TV show. I've actually never seen the show, but I love this little thing they enacted. What I want you to ask yourself is, why don't these women just stop? Okay? And then see what else you notice. Okay, so here we go. I'll start it again.
Excuse me. I know you didn't think anyone would catch you, but you just slammed your door into my car. The least you can do is say you're sorry, lady. You don't have to take that tone. It's not like I'm hurting your resale value. I'm sorry. See? Like that.
It's a marvelous time for Christmas. It's the time of the year. Snowflakes falling all around. Perfect time. Frolic all around. Have a merry, merry Christmas. Decked with holiday cheer. Holiday cheer. It's a marvelous time for Christmas. It's the wonderful time of the year. Frolic all around. Do great holiday
So, why can't they stop? Pardon? Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, right? Why can't they stop? Well, let me walk you through several questions here. By the way, I don't know what you noticed in that, but there's all kinds of things to notice about that. But as you think about both women, ask yourself this question: who needs to change? Both of them, right? Now this question: which one of them thinks they're the one who needs to change? Neither one of them, right? So who's likely to change? So how long is this likely to go on? Do you think it ended when their cars wouldn't move anymore? No, if they lived in the same neighborhood, you can imagine every time they got near each other, right? Well, why does this happen? How can our relationships with others, especially our difficult ones, be improved? How's that possible? Well, across my lifetime, I've heard of 3 basic strategies. Number one strategy is, well, others need to change. Well, that's what you just saw. By the way, how well did that work? Did you notice that in order for each woman to get back at the other woman, they actually had to damage their own car. They had to hurt themselves. And did you also notice that when the other woman was damaging my car, I was aghast, I was shocked. But when I now did the same thing to her car, there was a big smile. It was delicious. I really enjoyed that. That is most curious indeed. Okay? So the first strategy, others must change, continues the way that little video shows you. I change, which I think is the most successful approach. It needs to start with me. And the starting with me actually makes possible, but not certain, that others might change, so we might change together. There's no guarantee. I have to be willing to do it regardless. Well, I'd like to now show another video, and just to help you understand, this individual is from a police department in the Midwest. He is dealing with a very difficult set of circumstances, and he'll tell you about that. But notice he does not respond the way the women do. He responds quite differently.
As we talked about, my job, my squad, we serve high-risk search warrants on drug houses mainly. And we were serving a warrant over in the projects in the east side of the city. And this warrant was one we were anticipating as being a really good warrant. We had done several undercover buys from this individual. He was a convicted felon. The last drug buy that he did, he had a gun with him. So we like these type of warrants because this guy is a serious problem in the neighborhood, and with the charges we have on him, he's going to prison for a while. He's going to be out of the neighborhood, so it's very productive. And well, we went over to serve the warrant. We hit the house, break and rake on the windows, flash bangs. We ended up getting this guy in custody. He's got 2 guns, a bulletproof vest, more drugs, and there were 2 other people in the house that we arrested. And it was getting kind of dark. I mean, this is a really good hit. It's getting kind of dark, and we're going to move people outside because the power had been shut off at the house, and we couldn't see. We had no light in there, so we're going to move them outside and work in the yard on getting their names and that type of thing. So we're doing that, and I had a young officer riding with us. He was doing a ride-along to kind of see what it is that we do. And I'm taking him out into the yard, and I'm showing him what each officer is doing now that the actual execution phase is over. We got the log officer and the tracking officer and all the officers doing the different jobs. And him and I are talking, and I hear this screaming, yelling, this woman's voice. And I look up the street, and I see this lady coming at us down the middle of the road. And she is just screaming at the top of her lungs. And yeah, I'm kind of a visual person. And if you've ever seen one of those comets move through space, how it collects debris in its wake, that's kind of how this lady was. She was collecting people. As she moved down the middle of the road, people were coming out of their yards and falling in behind her. And she's making her way towards us. And the young officer that's with me, I see him looking down the road, and his jaws open, you know. And he looks at me and he goes, "Sarge, you want me to handle that?" And I said, "Let me try, but come with me. I might need some help." So I go with him, or he goes with me. I walk out and I meet this lady at the perimeter of the yard. And I stop and I said, "Good evening, miss. My name's Sergeant Huth, Kansas City Police. How can I help you?" And she just goes, "You," and blankety blank, and she starts screaming and cussing at me. And she's dressing me down. And I mean, she is going to town. And I'm kind of an amateur when I swear. Like if I hit my, thumb with a hammer, I'll let a swear word out or something. This lady was a professional. She was conjugating verbs. And I'm just listening. I step back and I listen to her, and finally she stops to take a breath. And I said, "Ma'am, let me see if I understand you correctly. You work 2 jobs, you bust your butt every day. You can't afford to fix your car, it's broken down in the driveway, which means you have to take the bus to and from your jobs. If it's cold outside, you're sitting in the cold. If it's hot outside, you're sitting in the heat." I said, "You worked hard all day long today, and you're thinking, I'm going to come home and just get off my feet and relax for a little while. But instead, you find that the SWAT team is kicked in your house, your son is under arrest, and your business is out here in the yard for all your neighbors to see." I said, "And it really pisses you off." And she goes, "Yes, it really pisses me off, yes." So I ask her a couple more questions. I let her talk for a while, and she comes way down. And all of the people that were with her just leave. And so when I feel like that she feels understood, I said, "Ma'am, listen, here's what's going on here today, and here's what we're doing with the search warrant. Now, before I leave, you're going to get a copy of the search warrant. You're going to get a receipt for anything we take, and we will let you know exactly where your son's going and what's going to happen with him. I can't let you back on the property while we're searching, but it is kind of chilly out here. I'll be glad to go get you an extra coat or a jacket from inside so that you can wait comfortably across the street. I said, how would that be? She goes, I'd really like that. So I go in and get the coat and bring it back out to her. And she waits peacefully across the street. And, you know, the young officer that's there watching this, he asked me, he goes, Sarge, he goes, well, you know, why don't you just take her to jail? And I said, listen, we could always just take her to jail. That's always an option. I said, but try to put yourself in her position. I said, if you come home from work and all those things that I said to her were true, you know, that you'd been working all day, you're tired, you know, I said, remember, she's got justifications in her mind that makes her son dealing drugs and all this other stuff going on okay. You know, she knows these things are happening, but she's justified it in her mind that makes it okay. You know, she's not part of it. She's working hard. I go, but imagine her coming home. If you came home and you see this happening, what would your initial reaction be? I mean, it wouldn't be, oh, I had this coming. You know, it would be like, man, this is an intrusion, and I'm embarrassed and I'm hurt. I go, by acknowledging that to her, by showing that I understood that, by recognizing her humanity, then she was much more able to be influenced by the content of what I had to say. And when we talked about it for a while, I said, listen, I could have taken her to jail, no doubt about it. I go, we'd probably had to fight her, then we had to fight a couple other people, and that would have been what we left the neighborhood with, was the image of us taking this middle-class neighborhood matriarch, this middle-aged neighborhood matriarch, you know, to jail over a disorderly conduct charge, which she was going to bond out on. So again, that was just an example there for me of being able to see the humanity of someone, being able to put myself in her position, stuff that I had not been able to do before. You know, before it was, again, you know, she's loud, she's challenged, and she needs to go to jail. And we need to make an example out of her in front of everybody. Well, the irony is we made an example out of her, but in a totally different regard. You know, and we actually, to an extent, recruited a supporter of what we do. And the reason I know she's a supporter is because these things tend to cascade out. Probably wasn't 20 minutes later, I heard another woman come screaming down the middle of the road. And the officer looks over at me and looks at her and he goes, you want me to handle this one? I said, wait a second. And as she gets closer, it's the daughter that lived there. And before we could say anything, the mom says, hey, they're just doing their job. Classic example of how it cascades out.
Click. Okay, now just think about those two videos, if you will. Think about that first diagram, the way of being diagram. You have these two women. Do they see each other as people? Do they see each other as objects? They're objects, right? They're just annoyances and bad, and they're horrible, and they're ruining my life, and I have which incidentally gives you great justification about how you can respond to others. Now think about that individual, Chip, okay? Is she, this woman who's coming down the road screaming obscenities, is she a person to him or an object to him? And because he sees that, where's his concern? Is it about him and protecting him and what's going on with them, making themselves look good, or is it about her and what she's just been delivered, what she's just now having to go through? So you have two very different responses to offensive things, if you will. In one, the other person takes offense immediately, and you're off and running in this tit-for-tat sort of thing. You offend me, I'm going to offend you. Okay, well, you have offended me, so I have every right now to offend you back. And it just gets in this cycle. We go round and round. But here, you have a very different response. Well, the nice part is the first one's fiction. That's made up. They must have had fun making up that film. But the second one's real life. And I love the fact that that's real life, that here's someone who's a police officer taking seriously the idea of needing to see the people they arrest as people, and the people related to them need to see them as people. Did it matter? It mattered hugely. Could you imagine leaving that neighborhood by arresting that woman and fighting her and struggling with her and maybe fighting some others, to leave that neighborhood with that image? When they look through that lens, how do you think they're going to respond to the police in the future? What will that invite them to do? Okay? Sorry, big white screen. So I would have you think now in your life, mostly in your own family, I think, someone you wish would change. Okay? Just identify them and Don't look at your spouse next to you and say, well, that would be you. We'd like to remain friends during this time. And then the question is, so which strategy are you going to take? You're going to try to change them, change yourself? I think the we change only comes after I change, okay? So this is what we call the pyramid. We have a number of names for it. We put a lot of adjectives in front of it: a parenting pyramid, an influence pyramid, a leadership pyramid, etc. But it helps us address this one simple issue: how can I help things go right? Okay? And the reason we ask that is often we're faced with things that are going wrong, right? I used to travel this country doing a lot of parenting courses, and I would teach this idea. And I would start with a group this size, for example, and I would ask them, I'd put an empty chair out and say, if we had the world's leading expert on parenting here, what questions? And these would be husbands and wives, moms and dads. I say, what questions would you ask that individual? Trying to make sure they didn't think it was me, but someone over here. They began to throw out the questions. How do I get my children to stop fighting? How do I get my children to do their homework? How do I get my children to hand in their homework once they've done it? How do I get my child off drugs? How do I get my children to join in family activities? How do I get my children to respect their mother, et cetera, the questions. Most of those questions fell into two broad categories. One of them was, what do I do when things go wrong? And the other was, well, how do I help things go right? And then I asked these parents this question: which of those, when you think about those two broad questions, which one do you spend most of your time and energy with? What do you think they answered? Dealing with things that are going wrong was the answer. It was the universal answer. Very rarely did someone actually have that flipped. But I'm going to invite us to think about flipping exactly that, so that when we're spending most of our time dealing with things that go wrong, the pyramid would look like this. Okay? And we're trying to switch it, so instead it works this way. To increase our productive influence, we want to spend most of our time, our energy, our efforts in helping things go right. But what does that mean? I mean, how do we make sense out of it? What does it mean to try to help things go right? Okay? Now, the outline of this pyramid, the perimeter, if you will, represents our available time. We don't have infinite time. Sometimes all we have is just a little bit. So within whatever time you have available, I'm going to walk you through this pyramid to see if it doesn't make some sense. When something goes wrong, what do we typically do? What's our first move almost always? Well, I've been a parent. Debbie and I have 9 children. They're all boys, except for the 8 daughters. It's nearly ruined me to have 8 daughters. It's been a little crazy. But when things went wrong, my inclination, my habit was to correct. I'm a psychologist by trade. I knew all kinds of corrections. I wanted to try those out on these experimental things we had at home. And so I would correct. I'd devise clever ways. And quite frankly, often after the correction, the need for correction persisted. In other words, it didn't work. Sometimes we correct and it works, right? But have you ever applied correction and it didn't correct the problem? Anybody ever have that experience? Okay. Well, the question now is, will more correction solve that problem? Because what do we typically do? Again, I can't speak for you, but I know me. Sometimes I would amp up the correction. I would come down a little harder. You're now grounded for your life. You will never leave this home. You've now joined a convent. Well, the first recommendation I'd make is, if it's not working, don't keep trying to do it. Okay? Correction won't be solved with more, the problem's not going to be solved with more correction. Then we're going to push you down the pyramid. And so the next level is to teach and communicate. Okay? Simple idea. If you think about it, if I correct without having done prior teaching, that will simply come across as punishment. Okay? And I don't think that's what we're after. I don't think that's what we want to do. We want something that's better than punishment. All you have to do is reflect upon your own life and ask yourself, how much did I like being punished? Right? Well, I don't. I would rebel against that instantly. So we need to teach. We need to help them learn about life. There's all kinds of things we ought to be doing, teaching about life, the meaning of things, etc. Help them tell them stories, draw out meanings. I remember in one night in a family home evening, you can imagine having 9 children, or 8 at the time. And my wife Debbie was giving a lesson on being honest and not stealing and things like that. And the kids could care less until Debbie told a time when she was 8 years old. She'd gone to a cousin's birthday party, and her cousin got a present that she just really, really admired. And she told her own children that she stole it. Instantly, every one of those children was paying strict attention to their mother. She talked about taking it home, knowing she shouldn't have it, and so she hid it in her bureau and never allowed herself a way to play with it. She'd stolen it, but never got anything out of it. It remained, and finally, after years, somehow it disappeared out of her drawer. And she talked about how it troubled her. And 9 little faces were focused on hers. And then one of them said, "Well, Mom, have you ever owned up to that, to your cousin?" And Debbie said, well, no. "Well, Mom, you wouldn't let us get away with that." So Debbie made a phone call that night, surrounded by 9 children who really wanted to hear that phone call. Think of the teaching that happened that night. So teach, tell stories, have meaning. However, sometimes I think you'll recognize, even though when you teach, it doesn't land. You might tell your child, well, in our house, 10 o'clock on weeknights, midnight on weekends, you have to be home by that time. That's your curfew. And the response is, well, that's stupid. Well, it may be stupid, but that's, and you might explain, you might teach more. And they say, well, no, and the other parents require that of their children. And you know how this conversation goes. Well, will more teaching solve that problem? Because think for a moment. There may be something else going on, for example, that you need to pay attention to, right? So the next level we'd have you begin to think about is the need to listen and learn. They're pushing back on something. And I don't know what that is. I just think they're being a problem. If I'm thinking that, I'm actually seeing people as objects when I'm trying to implement this pyramid. But if I would instead begin to think about what's going on with them, what are they thinking? Why are they pushing back in this way? What do they feel is unreasonable? And if I begin to wonder and question and explore and try to find out from them what's going on, why are you protesting in this way? That so much I might learn might be helpful. One of the things that the policeman did was he found out what she was troubled by. He let her rant. He used that as an opportunity just to hear her pain. And he honored that pain. He honored her anger. I cannot imagine how embarrassing it would be to have all your problems drug out on your front lawn, exposed to your whole neighborhood. I would think that would be hard. And so as he was open to that, by being willing to be influenced by her, she was now willing to be influenced by him. So learn, crawl into their world, find out what's going on. I travel a lot in my work. My insensitive, thoughtless boss sends me all over this world. I get to see a lot of places, but it's lonely. One hotel room's just as lonely as another hotel room. Well, during those times, Debbie's had to be a single parent. Okay, I'm gone. She's a single parent. She has to make decisions. Sometimes I'm in places where I can't phone home, I can't Skype home, I have no access. And she's had to make decisions. You can imagine having 5 daughters at once in the teenage years, wanting to date and go do things. And she's had to make decisions. Well, I trusted Debbie. She's far wiser than I am. Okay? I trusted her all the way until I came home. And when I came home, she would have a daughter would be saying, okay, Mom, I'll see you later. And I'm going, wait, hey, where are you going? And Debbie said, well, she's going out and, she and I have talked about it. I said, yeah, but I'm here. Why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't I part of this? And Debbie said, well, look, you trusted me when you were gone to make all these decisions. Why does that trust just disappeared? I never have liked questions like that. We struggled with that. I struggled mightily, and she began to struggle also with it, where she would then hide some of the, because I would overreact, so then she would begin to hide what the children were doing, what mischief they were getting into, so I wouldn't go off. It took me years to get better with this. Okay? Well, sometimes after I've listened and listened, I find that my children still don't want to tell me anything. But think for a moment. How well do you listen to someone you don't like? How well do you tell things to someone that bothers you? So we would push to another level. If even my listening and learning isn't helping here, there's yet another level I could pursue, which is to build a relationship, okay? Initially, with that child, with that spouse, with that brother or that sister, okay? And also with others who have influence with that individual. Now, if it's my children, if I'm going to build relationship with my child, then who else do you think has influence in their life? Is there any chance their mother has influence? And if you think about that for a moment, if Debbie and I are fussing with each other, if we're troubled with each other, does that affect my effectiveness with my children? Another way to ask that is, what's it like to be cared for when your caretakers don't care about each other? What's that like for the child? How many knew that growing up? Oh, my heavens. Am I the only guy? Thank you. I knew that growing up. When I was 16, the conflict in my home had reached the point where my father took his life. That blew my family apart. Probably immediately created my interest in trying to figure out how to not have these things happen in people's lives. The hardest part for me was 2 months prior to that, I had come home to discover my mother and father arguing verbally, loudly. As I stepped into the room, my father cuffed my mother. A very strong man. It tilted her over and she fell onto the couch. He hit her, knocked her down. As a 16-year-old, I was so angry, I loaded a pistol and chased him from the house. Fortunately, he did not try to do anything. This was many years ago, 1967. 2 months later, he took the same pistol and took his life. As a boy, as a son, I could not get my finger off the trigger in terms of the meaning of my life. Those of you who listened yesterday to Terry Warner understand something of why that was so devastating in our family. It took me 6 years to stop hating my father. It took 6 long years. It happened when I met when I was not LDS, I'm a convert to the church. I met a young woman in Orem, Utah. I told a story of my father's suicide. I'd been using that, quite frankly, to get things, to weasel my way into relationships. I'd also had a recurring dream, and in the dream, I would see through an open doorway, when I was occupied, my father walk by. In the dream, I would then race to the doorway, but it would be empty when I got there. The theme of abandonment was constant in these dreams. When I met this young woman, I told her the story of my father's suicide and the story of the dreams. When I told her about the dreams, unlike any other person I told that to, she laughed. She just chuckled, which was an affront. I couldn't believe how insensitive that was. You little twit, I thought. You have no idea. You've grown up with this wonderful little Mormon family. You have no idea what this is like. I said, what do you mean? How can you respond this way? And she said, well, you dreamed the dream. Well, in my 21-year-old lizard brain, I couldn't figure out what she was talking about. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she says, well, I see it like a stage. And you come on the stage over here, and then you see your father over here, and then he disappears, and you're left spinning around on the stage unhappy, but you're also in the back there with a headset on cueing everybody. It's your dream. It's your play. Your father's dead, right? He's not doing anything. This is what you're doing. She was 17, straight out of Orem High School, and I was in college. And she was smarter than I was. And then she said, well, if you could get to your father, what would you tell him? And I launched into a rather bitter tirade about what I would tell him, about what he had done to our family, et cetera, et cetera. I just let it come out. And she said a most interesting thing. She said, oh, that's interesting. You, at some level, Chris, get that his life was so painful that he took his life, that for you to tell him off would add to that pain. And you can't let yourself do it, can you? Wow, I'd never had that thought before. It had never occurred to me that my father was in pain. Isn't that odd? There's a blindness that comes with hate, with resentment. I had never had that thought. And so I said to her, what should I tell him? And this little 17-year-old girl scratched her head and thought for a moment. And then she said, I don't know. Maybe you could apologize for hating and resenting him. And I blew up. And I yelled at her, if anyone ought to apologize, it's him. He's ruined my life. And she said, no, Chris. He ruined his life. You're ruining yours. She did not know my father, but she knew enough about life to influence me to see him in a completely new way. It didn't happen that night, but it came later, several weeks later, because I could not unhear her words. I thought about it and I thought about it. And then one night, I remember thinking, there's plenty of evidence in my life of wrongdoing of mine toward him. The dream came again. In the dream, I saw him in a hardware store. I made my way into the store. He did not disappear. He remained there. I know I apologized. And I remember the embrace. My heart was changed, deeply and forever. I've never stopped missing or loving my father since that moment, because I woke up immediately and began to cry at the loss of my father and what I now missed. So when I think about the pyramid, it's the next piece that matters most. This is the way of being level. If my heart's not right, it doesn't matter what I do. It's going to be a problem. My teaching will be actually more like correction. It'll be just a subtle form of correction. It'll be pedantic and downward and a problem. My listening, you know how to listen, to point out their faults as opposed to listening to learn and discover. I can try to build relations. I can take a child out for a lunch or take a spouse out for dinner and be annoyed with her. I've done it plenty of times. What matters is the quality of our hearts more than anything else. So a pyramid, 3 quick lessons. One of them is most of my time and effort should be at the lower levels of the pyramid. I'm going to go through this too quickly for you to write. I apologize for that. A solution to a problem at one level of the pyramid is always going to be below that level. So if the correction's not working, go down the pyramid. Try some other area. I might teach. I might just simply need to go spend time with that relationship. And third, ultimately, my effectiveness at each level of the pyramid, all of them, that is my influence, depends upon the lowest level of the pyramid, my way of being, the quality of my heart. Okay? So I'm not going to have time for this.